Okay, so in the next couple lectures, I want to talk about cultural relativism. This is the last sort of challenge to morality or ethics as we usually think of it that I want to consider. Um, as with egoism, though, I think a good question, a good place to start is, what do we even mean by cultural relativism? We have this idea that cultural relativism is true. In some way, it keeps us from passing judgment on other cultures. Well, what is it? Why is it even a threat to ethics? All right. So first, very rough pass at what cultural relativism means is something like this. Different cultures have different moral codes, and it's wrong for one culture to judge the moral code of another, right? We say that something's wrong, we say that it's right. What we really mean is, well, our culture thinks this, our culture thinks it's wrong or right, and, but we realize or should realize other cultures might think differently, and if they do, we shouldn't judge them for it, right? Okay, so let's, some examples of this, the kinds of stuff Rachel's talks about, right? We think that, the best way to deal with the dead is to bury them, cremate them. The Greeks seem to agree with us. Well, the Galatians, this other group he talks about, they certainly don't seem to. They eat their dead, right? Or think of another one, Rachel's talks about the Inuit. When they were first contacted by Europeans, they had these strange practices. One that probably really still bothers us is that they would leave the elderly to die. They would also, in some cases, kill, female babies. And we probably think to ourselves, well, that's wrong, right? Our culture says you should treat the elderly well. Their culture doesn't seem to say that, right? Our culture says you certainly shouldn't kill a healthy infant. Their culture seems to allow it. Well, cultural relativism says, well, look, this is what we think, but that's just us. We can't judge the Galatians as weird. We can't judge the Eskimo, the Inuit, as doing something wrong. Now, I'm going to nail this down a little more because I think it's really important that we be more precise with what we mean by relativism, but this is just a first rough pass. Okay, so before we get into this, I want to say a little bit about why cultural relativism seems attractive. A lot of people are attracted to cultural relativism, or at least they think they are. To some people, it might even seem obviously true. Now, you guys will probably notice James Rachel's is not attracted by relativism. He doesn't think it's a good theory. He doesn't think there's much to be said in favor of it. In fact, most of his article is just giving the idea of relativism a really hard time, right? And I'll lay my cards on the table to you guys. I tend to agree with Rachel's. I don't think the arguments for relativism are very good, at least the interesting forms of cultural relativism. And I think the arguments against cultural relativism are pretty convincing. But I do want to give relativism a fair shake. Any theory that a lot of intelligent people find attractive, and a lot of intelligent people do find this theory attractive, has to have something going for it. Well, what is that? Well, I think there's two things that make cultural relativism attractive. One is just that, look, there's just this incredible variety in what cultures think. Rachel's gives some nice examples at the beginning, of his article. If you guys think for even 10 seconds, you can probably come up with more. But I think an even more important one is just that we're in a position now that we realize that a lot of truly awful things have been done by one culture in the name of imposing their moral values that they always claim are superior, onto another, right? Think of the Spanish in South America, even in the North America for a while. They did a lot of nasty things, especially to the native cultures. Well, it was all in the name of, we have this superior morality we're going to impose on you, right? Or think of the British in India. Again, the British did a lot of terrible things. And again, it was like, well, we're more advanced. We have a better morality. We're going to teach these less advanced peoples, put that in scare quotes, our better morality. That's why we're doing this, right? Colonialism of all kinds, wars of conquest, just awful, awful stuff seems to get justified in the name of one culture and its superior morality, imposing that morality on another culture, right? So, the relativist starts with this idea that I think, a lot of us would agree to. Well, shouldn't we be cautious in judging the morality of another culture given all the awful things that seem to stem from that? Now, what I think Rachel's would say, and what I would definitely say is, I think we can be cautious about judging another culture without becoming full-on relativists, but I'll say more about that toward the end. I think there's a lesson here. I think there's something here. There's a lesson we should draw, but maybe going on to full-on relativism, that's not the lesson. But I'll say more about that as we go on. Okay, so, we've got to the point we do need to have, I think, more of a discussion, break this down into more detail. What do we mean by cultural relativism? Now, Rachel's actually, he's very thorough about this, right? He says we can mean 6 different things by relativism, at least 6 different ones. Different societies have different moral codes. Number 1. Number 2, no objective standard that can be used to judge the societal code. Judge one societal code better than another. Number 3, moral code of our own society has no special status. Number 4, no universal truth in ethics. That is, there are no moral truths that hold for all peoples at all times. 5, moral code of a society determines what is right within that society. 6, it is mere arrogance for us to try to judge the conduct of other peoples. We should adopt an attitude of tolerance toward the practices of other cultures. Now, Rachel says you want to be clear on which of these you have in mind. Some of these might be true without the others being true, right? And Rachel's will admit that relativism, in one sense of these terms, might be true, but he thinks in other senses it's going to be false. Well, now look. I don't have the time to really go through each of these. It would get confusing. It would take a very long time. You'll notice that I have 2 in red, number 1 and number 4. I think these are the interesting ones. These are the important ones for reasons I'll talk about in a second. So we're going to focus on 1 and 4. 1, different societies have different moral codes. 4, no universal truth in ethics. That is, there are no moral truths that hold for all people at all times. Well, why focus on these? Well, I think for the reason I focus on number 1 is that I think number 1 is pretty clearly true. I mean, again, we might have to be more precise what we mean by it, but in a pretty obvious sense, in a normal way of interpreting this sentence, it's true. The beginning of Rachel's essay with these examples of the Galatians and the Greeks, the Inuit and us, give us reason to think 1 is true. If you don't think 1 is true, subscribe to the National Geographic for a while, right? Take an anthropology class. You will see that 1 is definitely true. Why focus on 4, though? Well, I think 4 is the interesting one, right? 4 is the one that would have really radical results. 1 is almost certainly true, but is 4? Well, that's the question I want to ask. So you might think, well, you can just go from the truth of 1 to the truth of 4. So that's what I'm doing here with an argument. Different cultures have different moral codes, so there is no universal truth in ethics. Now ask yourself, is this a good argument? I think you ought to say it isn't, right? You know, different cultures have different moral codes, so there's no universal truth in ethics. Well, two can definitely be false if one's true, right? Doesn't seem obvious how you get from 1 to 2. This is not a valid argument. It's missing a lot of premises. Well, look, he throws this out and he says, well, let's not even think about it. But I think let's give this argument a fair shake. Let's do what we did, in the argument lectures. Let's fill in the premises and see if the argument works now. I'm going to say that, in fact, it won't. So here is, at least as far as I think, the most obvious, the most logical way to fill this in to make a valid argument out of it. Different cultures have different moral codes, so different cultures disagree on the subject of ethics. If there is disagreement about some subject, then there is no universal truth about that subject, so there is no universal truth in ethics. Well, now we have a valid argument for the conclusion, right? But remember, think back to our lectures on argument. An argument can be valid and not be terribly convincing. The argument, valid just means, well, if the premises are true, the conclusion can't be false. Well, we still have to ask, are the premises true? Now look, on this one, I think 1 is true. 2, it might not be so clear. What does it mean to disagree on the subject of ethics? We'll come back to this. But let's just grant 2. The problem here is that 3 is, I think, almost certainly false. Premise 3, the argument needs it to work. This conditional, if there's disagreement, then no universal truth. Well, the argument needs it, but I don't think 3 is a good principle. Why not? Well, Rachel's talked some about this, but I think it's good to just hammer it home. Think about this, right? Do you really want to claim that the simple fact people disagree about something shows that there's no universal truth about the thing they disagree about? If you think about it, I bet you don't want to agree with that claim. Let me just give you a clear demonstration of this, right? Why premise 3, why this principle is not something we're going to want to agree to. So look, for this one, I'll just pick on my poor grandma, right? My grandmother believed in a lot of home remedies. And one of her home remedies was, well, if you get poison ivy, the rash from poison ivy, Grandma would say you should pour bleach on it. Please don't do that. That is not a good idea. I'm guessing some of you are shuddering as you listen to this, and you should be. Pouring bleach on the rash you get from poison ivy is a terrible idea. One of my poor uncles tried it. It didn't work too well, right? Well, my grandma thinks that it does. Guess what? My mom doesn't agree with her. My mom's a nurse. If you ask my mom what you should do about poison ivy, she would say, get some hydrocortisone cream, rub that on it. So there's disagreement about the subject of the best way to treat poison ivy. Well, think about it this way, right? Let's think about what premise 1 would tell us. Premise 1 says if there's disagreement here, there's no universal truth. So there's disagreement on how to treat poison ivy. So if we buy this principle, that means there is no universal truth about the best way to treat poison ivy. That's completely insane, right? There is a best way to treat poison ivy. It is not pouring bleach on it. Hydrocortisone is the way you want to go, right? Think of a lot of other cases, right? You can even think about stuff cultures disagree on. Some cultures have thought the world was, a flat disk. Some cultures have thought the world was a globe. Well, guess what? The ones that think it was a globe, they're right. The ones that think it's flat are wrong. Just because people disagree about what shape the Earth is doesn't mean there's no truth about what shape the Earth is. Same thing goes for cultural relativism. Just because different cultures disagree about morality, disagree about ethical judgments, doesn't show that there's no fact about ethical judgments, about moral judgments. So this is a bad argument. The principle it needs to work is not one that we want to accept, especially when we start to think about what it really commits us to. Okay. So where we're at so far is just this, right? The arguments for relativism, at least relativism in this interesting sense, in sense 4, aren't really all that good. We don't have good reasons to think it's true. We might have good reasons to think that relativism in sense 1 is true, but sense 1 isn't the interesting one. The more interesting one, we don't have good reasons to think it's a good argument. All right, so that's half of Rachel's critique of relativism, just showing that the usual arguments for relativism aren't very good. But let's go, in the next lecture I want to talk about the other half of Rachel's argument. And Rachel's, in this part of his argument, he's going to give us reasons to think relativism's actually false. All he's done so far is to show that the arguments for relativism aren't that good. In the next one, we're going to talk about arguments to show that relativism's actually false, right? So let's move on to those.